The genesis of the demise of cultural relativism can be found in the culturally relativist AAA's withdrawal from the Commission of Human Rights in 1947, because they advocated for communal equality and the UDHR for equality among individuals. The AAA rejected human rights, claiming that any attempt to formulate postulates that grow out of the beliefs or moral codes of one culture must to that extent detract from the applicability of any declaration of human rights to mankind as a whole. They just rejected universal human rights upon the premise of cultural relativism, believing that any attempt to impose absolute rights upon every culture violated what had become their most fundamental belief. They could only advocate for the equality of a society rather than that of an individual, creating an impassable paradox. This paradox contradicts itself, as cultural relativism was initially a movement of hope, promoting equality, yet it impedes the assurance of equality for an individual. In an increasingly individualistic society, this paradox was fatal to the theory. This is merely the first contradiction of many that arises when cultural relativism is applied to a society in which scientific racism and ethnocentrism are no longer hegemonic ideologies. The second is that from a cultural relativist perspective, the UDHR is merely an expression of Western culture and thereby a blatant demonstration of ethnocentrism, evoking the censure of cultural relativists. This increased support for cultural relativism amongst anthropologists, that collectively with the trauma of racial conflict in the United States and American intervention in Vietnam, meant a great number of anthropologists became even more alienated from the society in which they found their material support, and more sympathetic towards those societies that were perceived as victims of the values of the dominant society, attacking the concept of objectivity and value-free inquiry in the process. This denotes that the anthropologist's rejection of the Declaration of Human Rights is demonstrative of the influence of cultural relativism on the anthropological community at the time, suggesting the rapid growth of the ideology since it emerged in opposition to scientific racism. Cultural relativism, having caused a paradigm shift, turned from a critical, marginalized ideology into a hegemonic one, causing many supportive anthropologists to be ostracized as the human rights movement grew towards the turn of the century. A second controversial paradigm shift was thus initiated, moving away from cultural relativism. Indeed, many of those who oppose cultural relativism argue that the ideology is self-refuting in today's society. Louis Pojman, professor of philosophy, maintained that the tolerance encouraged by cultural relativism was deeply flawed because, if morality is simply relative to each culture, then if the culture does not have the principle of tolerance, its members have no obligation to be tolerant. This clearly emphasizes the conflicting nature of cultural relativism, showing that it may only succeed in theory, never in application, because if the culture it is being applied to has no ethical obligation to be tolerant of other cultures, it cannot be criticized for it. Although this is accurate, some of Pojman's supporting arguments are erroneous. He conservatively alleges that social reformers must therefore always be morally wrong, as they oppose cultural standards. This is flawed, as since they are criticizing their own society, their criticisms must be inherently culturally justified. This can be linked to the original premise of cultural relativism. If scientific racism was culturally ingrained, it could not be criticized by anyone other than those of that culture, by definition a reformer. This would stipulate that reformers stimulate social development, promoting its evolution and progression. The controversial nature of cultural relativism and its philosophical and moral implications have become further entrenched in the 21st century, demonstrated in the rise of neo-racism. Due to the progression of scientific technology since the 20th century, racist movements can no longer promote discrimination on the grounds of a belief in biological differences, but espouse a differentialist racism based on a conviction in the fixity of culture, paradoxically borrowed from the culturally relativist anti-racist arguments. After the 1960s, a paradigm shift occurred, drawing racism away from discrimination based on biology, as it became socially unacceptable, leading to the collapse of biologically founded racism. However, as the world has become increasingly globalized with the development of social media, multiculturalism has been emphasized simultaneously with the preservation of cultural difference, causing culture rather than biology to become the primary distinguishing factor between groups of people. Although cultural relativism was a movement of hope in the 20th century, the decline of initially opposing ideologies led to its abuse through neo-racism in the 21st century.